Buenos días. Vamos a ver esto, ¿no? Sí, sí. Confirmo. Ciao Alberto.
¿Todo bien?
Espero que sí. Está bien. Funziona.
Ok.
Good.
Aspetta, passo
Il micro? Aspetta.
Sì, solo perché devo solo questo.
Un momentito.
2 minuti.
Estoy un poco preocupada porque me hace un mensaje muy raro.
¿Qué? ¿Qué pasa?
Tengo producto desactivado.
¿Qué no es por activar?
No, que no lo entiendo. Ayer estaba bien.
¿Qué es que no entiendes?
Esto de que no sé qué significa esto de para seguir usando.
No.
No toco nada.
Ah, no, passa nada.
No puede ser.
Creo que podemos empezar. Buongiorno a tutti e a tutti. Benvenuti e benvenute all'ultimo keynote del nostro convegno. Da parte mia voglio ringraziare gli organizzatori, in particolare Giacomo Fronzi, per aver organizzato così bene questo evento e per avermi invitato a introdurre appunto Matilde Carrasco Barranco, che è professoressa di Estetica e Teoria delle Arti, Estetica e Teoria delle Artes nel Dipartimento di Filosofia dell'Università di Granada, dopo essere stata per diversi anni professoressa di Estetica all'Università di Murcia. La sua attività di ricerca si è orientata verso la filosofia morale al principio e poi ha rivolto i suoi interessi di ricerca verso l'estetica. In questo ambito si è dedicata a chiarire la natura cognitivo-affettiva dell'esperienza e del giudizio estetico, all'analisi delle categorie estetiche, facendo particolare attenzione alla nozione di bellezza, in particolare ultimamente nell'ambito del performativo. Si è interessata inoltre alla teoria e alla critica dell'arte contemporanea, alle relazioni tra arte e società. E attualmente esplora il valore estetico-performativo delle pratiche artistiche, sociali e collaborative con un'attenzione specifica alle relazioni di cura che saranno il tema del suo intervento. Ha pubblicato il volume Consecuencias, Agencia y Moralidad e curato altri diversi libri, ha pubblicato ovviamente diversi articoli, fra cui recentemente un articolo presso il Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, American Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, e ci conosciamo da diversi anni perché abbiamo anche tra l'altro collaborato insieme nel board dell'European Society for Aesthetics. Attualmente è presidente della Società Spagnola di Estetica y Teoría de las Artes, SEITA. La ringraziamo per aver accolto l'invito a partecipare al nostro convegno con una conferenza, il cui titolo è Care as Political Artistic Practice. Matilde, the floor is yours. E anche il microfono.
Grazie. I'd like to thank the Society for this invitation. It's a great honor. Thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you especially to the organizers, Giacomo, fantastic work, thank you very much, Paolo, and of course Alessandro. Mi dispiace non parlare italiano e spero che parlare in inglese renda più facile comprendere il mio discorso. La presentazione cercherà anche di evidenziare i punti più rilevanti della mia argomentazione. And so I will start correcting the title. How many times can you look at your presentation and now I realize that is not exactly the scale as political artistic practice, but I think the rest is okay. So let's start by offering a brief introduction of the main points of the presentation. In this talk, I aim to show how care is playing an important role in socially engaged artistic practices, in line with the political significance that care has today. Is that all right? You hear me okay? Good. I argue that the interest in care relationships is also part of a transformation in the affective regime of contemporary art, which now seeks to reclaim the value of emotions such as empathy, emotions that may have been considered soft or even taboo in much of 20th century art, particularly political art. I also contend that ethical practices of care possess an inherently aesthetic dimension and are embedded in forms of political art. Particularly art that has been called an art of the politics of capabilities. That is, a sort of participatory art that seeks to empower individuals by involving them in collaborative activities that inspire more democratic and just forms of sociability. So, I will start arguing this moral and political significance of care today. I think we can say that we live in a time of care. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the awareness of human fragility and vulnerability. It connects, however, to other issues such as the climate crisis and the increase in life expectancy, which has already placed a significant portion of the population, at least in those countries where the aging process is a reality, in the position of needing care. These are shared challenges that affect us all, emphasize our interdependence, and demand collective and supportive responses. We could continue citing many other difficulties faced by vulnerable groups due to reasons of gender, race, class, or origin, which also generate a demand for care, not to mention the central role care plays in our daily lives, where our most urgent and intimate needs are met. It seems then that care constitutes a primarily ethical issue due to its ubiquity and the diversity of circumstances in which it is required, perhaps with particularly significance today in the social and political spheres. It has therefore shed the invisibility that for centuries excluded it from public debate. For philosophical thought, care did not become a concept worthy of study until just 50 years ago, when feminist philosophers developed the ethics of care, following Carol Gilligan's seminal essay, In a Different Voice. Gilligan precisely offered a different voice, or alternative, to the dominant perspective in Western moral philosophy, which was centered around concepts such as equity, impartiality, justice, universality. These general concepts shaped normative approaches based on principles that, in the name of rationality and the objective treatment of moral issues, abstracted from the particular circumstances of individuals and the context in which people's moral lives unfold. Gilligan highlighted the difference between men and women when justifying decisions and choices to resolve moral problems. While men tended to appeal to general rules of justice, women were more likely to put themselves in the other shoes also considering emotional implications and the concrete context and circumstances involved. Far from constituted, as it seemed, a sign of woman's inferior moral maturity, Gilligan defended this shift in perspective as a call to attention regarding the insufficiency of universalist approaches. She argued for the need to situate ethical deliberations within a moral sympathetic perspective, attentive to the particularities of each case, one that could be seen as more feminine. Shortly after, in 1984, Nell Nodins published Caring, subtitled A Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education. Together, they will have shown that a domain traditionally restricted to women could be a source of an ethics that encourages cultivating sensitivity, thoughtfulness, empathy. However, accusation of gender essentialism made Nodins replace the title in the term feminine by relational. The important thing is that the ethics of care pointed to a different way of being and building the world, one that was relational and interdependent in contrast to other more individualistic models. In this way, care gradually shifted from being seen as a domestic matter and a woman's issue to being understood as a public concern and a democratic duty. The interpersonal relationship, mainly developed within the family, extended to other broader social relationships, as well as to the care of non-human creatures, nature, environments, and even the realm of objects. In summary, we can endorse the widely quoted definition by Berenice Fischer and Joan Tronto, who describes caring as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. However, all this does not mean forgetting the reality in which care practices unfold. Performances of care enact inequalities of power and privilege that determine care distribution and who undertake it. Thus, vulnerability affects both sides. Carers often abuse their charges and patronize care receivers, but often as well, carers are exploited as cheap labor with almost no rights at all. Hence, the politics of care takes into account that caring structures and practices are in many times, in fact, uncaring, and that care is considered as a commodity, something that we buy, instead of something that we expect to do, or generally is decried as a burden. However, the notion of care incorporates value, which indicates how we should act and relate with other people and the world. So Joan Tronto defined 4 ethical elements of care: attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness, which care performances should incorporate, corresponding with the 4 phases of care. Caring about, this is the recognition that care is necessary. Taking care of, namely assuming some responsibility for the need and determining how to respond. Caregiving, which means being directly involved in meeting the needs of care. And care receiving, this is recognizing the response of the person receiving the care. To sum up, care is not only assisting the needs of others, it's not any job, because care is a way of doing things, which includes a set of appropriate skills and invokes affective qualities, pointing to human relationality and interdependence, trying to overcome the asymmetric relation that constitute it by definition. From a political perspective, the need to cultivate more empathetic and compassionate beings, attentive to the needs of others, aware of interdependence in the recognition of a shared vulnerability, contrasts with the neoliberal rationality that demands as a moral idea a self-sufficient individualism and increases the vulnerability of the most disadvantaged ones. And care opposes a more social agenda, so of social responsibility and mutual care. Despite everything, even in democratic countries that seem safe from it, the rise of this neoliberal view in its more radical forms, ones that abandons or deteriorates public services, ignores or attacks environmental conservation, or dehumanizes migrants, makes one think that rather than recognizing that we live in a time where care is assumed to be a task that concerns us all, the commitment to care today may constitute a risky option of resistance, even political rebellion. In her speech during the 2025 SAG Awards, Jane Fonda declared, "What we actors create is empathy. Our job is to understand another human being so profoundly that we can touch their souls. And make no mistake, empathy is no weak or woke. By the way, woke just means you give a damn about other people." So that, clearly referring to the political changes that accompany the new American government, Fonda stated, "This is big time serious, folks. So let's be brave. We must stay in community. We must help the vulnerable. We must find ways to protect an inspiring vision of the future, one that is becoming welcoming." Even before the arrival of the new American administration, two activists from the States, Kelly Hayes and Marianne Cava, affirmed, "We believed in caring for each other as a form of cultural rebellion." After decades witnessing the cross-mobilization of mutual aid and mass protest across many important sites of political struggle, such as the fight against racism in the United States, Hayes and Cava argued that solidarity is the most natural response among human beings when facing common problems, especially difficult in the case of catastrophes. The activists wondered why such narratives are less widespread than the official stories or those heavily publicized through, for example, Hollywood films, individual heroes, and the every man for himself mentality. And they defended how participants in movements or webs of mutual aids can be tough on systems by nurturing a counterculture of care. Such culture, they say, requires the undoing of the individualism and silhouette politics and harbors the potential for new life-giving frameworks, which is not the outcome the powerful are hoping for. However, maybe speaking of care as countercultural may seem novel among other things, because the promotion of mutual care, in a way, appear foreign to the artistic strategies of the 20th century counterculture, which were dominated by protest through provocation and transgression. Also, in her introduction to the book, Marianne Cava admits that early in her activism, I was a major brat to people who I proudly proclaimed were sellouts because they had to be accountable to private funders and to the man, until someone asked her, "What have you built?" And she realized that protest was not enough. Indeed, despite proposing alternative life experiences to those derived from the capitalist system and the society of spectacle, in the 20th century counterculture was mostly identified with protest, especially in the artistic sphere, dominated by neo-avant-garde trends, sometimes referred to as an anti-artistic. We can sum it up by saying with Arthur Danto that in contemporary art abounds art that is disturbatory. He means art that aims to disrupt the typical viewer experience, moving beyond mere contemplation and engaging the viewer in a more visceral level. Those works confront audiences with the realities of life, aiming to produce reactions that are continuous with real life experiences. They dissolve the traditional distance between representation and reality. But what is key of this sort of art is that it's intended to modify the consciousness and even change the lives of these viewers. Thus, it seems that it's committed to producing certain effects in the viewer that may lead to moral, social, or political change. But to get it, art had to be somehow disturbing. In this respect, Dante comments examples of feminist performance that he argues is funky, aggressive, confrontational, flagrant, shocking, daring, extreme, and meant to be sensed as dangerous. Indeed, performance art that, according to Dieter Mersch, mostly aimed at sparkling social revolt, could work as a paradigm of what Dante calls disturbatory art. Mersch comments that in the early 60s, some performances were less about getting the audience to participate or shaping their senses and more about shaking them and shocking them. Performance relies on disruption, he says, on making the positing of difference into an event, and insists that performance derives its ethical dimension from this kind of transgression. Much of this political art claimed not to be not only anti-artistic, but anti-aesthetic, since a set of ideas such as the autonomy of art, taste, beauty, visual pleasure, sensuousness, and expressive genius, and so forth, were negated. According to Hans Forster's famous definition of the anti-aesthetic, while those categories of the aesthetic represents the idea of a privileged realm, the postmodern anti-aesthetic signals art that now can affect the world. Nonetheless, others have seen in postmodern art not so much an anti-aesthetic art as a rejection of traditional aesthetics that transformed aesthetic problems. In the end, as Mersch says, in performance, the aesthetic and the political are inseparable. That was, anyway, an aesthetics of transgression and of political protest and rebellion against injustice. Also in this official artistic culture of today, he named that and through, Dante saw activist art that he described as angrily political. He explained that as means of advancing social and political agendas, artistic activism tries to make people angry, not so much against the works, but what the works are about. Dante claimed that political protest needs anger at its trigger, encouraging the necessary prolongation of the struggle and the impulse to counteraction. However, although when injustice, abuse, and wrongdoing happen, anger is certainly justified, very often anger motivates stupid and dangerous decisions. As Susan Sontag stated, you cannot hit and think at the same time. Besides, we can say with Kathleen Mary Higgins that the big threat to effective political action is despair, and that political activism requires not only commitment and courage, but also faith, and therefore hope. In the same lines, Marianne Cava proclaims taking action is a practice of hope. But anger can be even, compatible with hope, even express love, agape love, a universal love that involves goodwill and respect. This is how Misha Sherry identifies a sort of anger that is not merely destructive, rather fills with optimism and motivates to fight, to pursue justice and radical change in society from an inclusive perspective. This is for all, including the wrongdoers. She calls it Lordian rage, after the black feminist scholar and poet Audre Lorde, whose work on anger and race inspired Sherry to theorize about this matter. Detached from hatred and revenge, Lordian rage can be of service to a rightful political activism that focuses on more productive, forward-looking thoughts. Thus, as I see it, political activism nowadays vindicates the role of hope, love, and mutual aid as a smart strategy of protest and action. Since, as Hayes and Cava insists, solidarity with one another could be our best hope. Although the 20th century activist art has traditionally been associated with disturbance and shock, the vindication of care as political practice should have also reached art. Hope, love, compassion, empathy, solidarity, care seems to be attitude and emotional states that are becoming prominent in political activism. These words and feelings have been long suppressed in artistic and critical vocabularies. And yet, Rebecca Bedell, an art historian, sustains that they're rebounding. Bedell identifies a transformation in the emotions of contemporary art. We cannot say, that such emotions, to which she refers as tender and connective, wholly disappear from art, since such emotions could be found even within the work of the avant-garde, but nonetheless, for the most influential narratives of the art of the past century, they were relegated to ordinary life and the intellectually despised realm of mass culture. The phenomenon is not new, because as Bedell analyzes also within Western art, the emotions considered acceptable for artistic expression have undergone dramatic transformations over time. In the case of tender and connective emotions, Bedell points out the rhetoric of modernism and postmodernism for turning them into a sort of taboo for artistic practice. Briefly, she recalls how the emotions of life, Clive Bell called them, were declared irrelevant to the appreciation of art. The champion of formalism, Clement Greenberg, thought of this emotion as sentimental and consigned them to the despised realm of kitsch. However, emotions like angst, rage, despair, and doom were reconciled with the heroic and tormented masculinity of the mid-avant-garde represented by American abstract expressionists. Later, the pretended aesthetic indifference that followed up in movements such as minimalism, along with the ironic provocation of pop art, deepened the discredit of emotions considered to be too soft. Finally, postmodernism left little room for them, taking further the concept of the avant-garde, which valued originally above almost all else. Over the decades, the aim was to achieve the shock of the new, which demanded increasingly strained ploys, challenging viewers veered into disturbing, disgusting, and horrifying them I have just described. Bedell notes that the suppression of the tender and connective emotions has much to do with misogyny and elitism, but both misogyny and elitism are often linked by their disdain of the space of the everyday, which in many cases is identified with the domestic, the feminine, the private, traditionally differentiated from the truly important things which have occupied philosophy, politics, or art as critical attitudes toward the world. In other words, this invisible realm is where care practices have been located until very recently, as I have argued as well at the start. So Bedell's hypothesis is that the transformation of emotions in contemporary art could start in the 90s. Significantly, the AIDS epidemic may have played a part as artists gave expression not only to anger and outrage, but also to grief, care, and concern. She also mentions movements like Black Lives Matter, but it's the COVID-19 pandemic that probably caused the acceleration of a process of transformation of the emotional regime of art, which gave back love, compassion, empathy, or care, also to advance social, political, and environmental justice. So let's focus, I would like to focus though on a particular kind of political art, collaborative art, because I think the promotion of improvement of care practices as a political artistic purpose is developing, especially in projects of this sort. First, collaborative art is a kind of participatory art. Participatory art is art that requires the active participation of the audience as a constitutive part of the artwork proper. Participatory art defies the traditional contemplative stance toward art because the participants and their actions are an inherent part of the work. But certainly, the label participatory art covers a huge diversity of production according to various levels of participation, both of artist and audience. In the projects defined as collaborative, the artist's task is to design and create devices and sets up for people to engage in certain activities of cooperation. Thereby, artists give them enough guidance to bring the project of performance to life, yet must adapt to what happens, fostering high levels of freedom of choice and action to avoid patronizing the audience. There are many projects of this sort, but for example, the project Intimate Bridges, maybe you know, because it took place between the end of 2019 and mid-2021 in different European countries, one of them Italy, others Portugal, Greece, and Austria. In the introduction to this to the book, that collects the results of the project, they say, involving artists and non-artists, migrants and non-migrants, European citizens and world citizens, intimate bridges seek to promote the recognition and appreciation of diversity, personal development, empowerment, and empathy. So it's indeed a kind of political art, but of the kind that the Spanish philosopher Gerard Vilar refers to as an art of the political capabilities. These are artistic practices that differ from other forms of political art that might seem more familiar to us. Of course, commemorative art, for example, is the oldest, I will say, in political art, but also perhaps what is currently understood as political art is the sort of art that denounces moral and political injustice, denunciatory art, as we call it, that we have seen develops especially in the 20th century. This is political art that clearly identifies the cost to fight and calls for action. However, there are other more contemporary forms of political art that do not offer slogans nor is activist in that sense, but rather invites autonomous reflection via uneasy proposals that challenge and maybe disturb our sensibility, so each person can reflexively reach their own conclusions. Vilar gives examples of, for example, Thomas Hitchell's installation or Santiago Sierra's performances. Now, what he names an art of the political capabilities is a different thing. It's an art that aims to alter the roles and functions of the experience of art in order to change the capabilities of a participatory audience by fostering the cultivation of their capabilities or by providing them with new ones. For this reason, Vilar believes that these are forms of emancipatory art. It is art that trusts the participants and empowers people, often those who usually do not speak up, encouraging their self-confidence and inspiring more democratic and just form of sociability. I would say that this is somehow activist political art, yet beyond protest and denounce, tries to build something using Cava's terms. In any case, and of course consider that in certain sense all art is political, I like Vilar's classification of different kinds of political art. The classification is not essentialist, not thus to exclude, it doesn't try to exclude others, all sorts of bordered cases and hybrids forms of political art. Because, but I like it because it helps to differentiate and somehow organize the always changeable, multiple and complex relationships between art and politics. And I like it because I find the notion of an art of the political capabilities very enlightening and useful to analyze collaborative projects and particularly care practices within their frame. I think that projects like Intimate Bridges or examples given by Vilar, like the famous Favela Painted, founded in 2005 by Hassan Khan, and that consisted in the restoration and painting by the locals in cooperation with artists of the houses and streets of the favela, creating this colorful mosaic. These are art of the political capabilities, art that tries to empower people, that practices equality in community, therefore inspiring democratic dialogue and enables them to pursue their lives with dignity and respecting their own views. But I would note that in these examples, they are projects that do so, at least in part because they practice and promote care. In a recent study, Lara García Díaz has analyzed the caring practices that emerged during the construction of a social communitarian center in Cañada Real in Madrid. This is a very, very poor part of probably the biggest illegal asentamiento, we call it, the tents and that people living in Europe. Well, the construction of this, as she reports, was in charge of the architect's studio, Recetas Urbanas, a studio founded by architect Santiago Figureda, committed to collaborative self-construction as a means to promote social integration and mediate within various complex realities. García Díaz uses the analytical framework designed by Joan Tronto, which differentiates 4 phases for effective care, and that in correspondence should exhibit 4 ethical elements. Let's recall that the first step towards effective care is recognizing that care is necessary by caring about, which demands attentiveness. Next, taking care of, which means assuming some responsibility for the need and determining how to respond, followed by actual caregiving, which requires competence, and finally, care receiving, which involves responsiveness. García Díaz details how the project is designed according to care guide from the start, insofar as social clauses related to identification of needs, inclusion, and education were explicitly included in the contract. Thus, the execution of the project showed attentiveness to the needs of a concrete community, caring for their participation, integrating women and children, sharing common challenges provoked by cultural, ideological, and religious factors, assuming responsibility yet offering a safe context, executing competent strategies and methodologies perceived as caring by the participants, and being flexible and responsive in the interaction, accentuating the ideally reciprocal nature of care. So as mentioned, care ethics indicates how bad care is often practiced, but offer tools to empirically test and correct such practices. Tronto's framework could be used also to analyze collaborative artistic projects such as favela painting or intimate bridges that situate themselves between art and social change. García Díaz concludes that good care is aimed at providing as much sense as possible of independency and safeness to the agent, the community, or the institution that is being taken care of. And so I will insist, is art of political capabilities. However, care practices are guided by the specific ethical commitment just described in Tronto's model. So finally, I will like to point out also that as care ethics insist, care is a practice that beyond the intentions must be carried out, taking into account all the circumstantial and contextual aspects that make care relationships unique. There are no formulas for care. Only through caring what care is could be learned and knowing if we are practicing good care. Through the 4 phases, the quality of our care actions relies on our skills of perception and recognition of what is adequate in each situation. In a recent article, Joseph Courbet, who is a moral philosopher, analyzes care is not an instrumental activity focused on achieving a goal, no matter how is this reached, but rather an activity inspired by a telos. And so he says care actions require a kind of deliberation that seeks to discern what response is constitutive of such telos in some particular circumstances. Hereby, care practice departs from an initial apprehension of this telos, but is the engagement in this activity that requires a continuous effort to discern what the telos may demand from each participant in any particular circumstance. Based on the description of concrete scenes where subjects are engaged in different activities of care, Courbet admits that the recognition of such demands will often be tacit and will manifest itself in some nuances or gesture of behavior. Therefore, the telos cannot be individuated regardless of our ability to recognize how certain gestures, words, or nuances of behavior enhance or reduce it. Care ethicists have often emphasized the importance of the expression and communication of care, as it has an appearance, which is crucial indeed to perform and evaluate care decisions and actions. So the last point I want to make in my talk is that care is not only an ethical practice, but an aesthetic practice as well. This is the basic claim of the so-called aesthetics of care that I would like to introduce here, understood as an aesthetic relevant for the political capabilities and consequently for the art that seeks to promote them. So let's go to the last. Indeed, the aesthetics of care is a very recent area of research that affirms that the practice of care holds an aesthetic dimension, At the experiential level, the expression of care, its form, its appearance, that's the aesthetic dimension. Thus, aesthetics is seen as integral to care, since care is a practice, a process which constitutes the outcome, affording both the performance of care and its evaluation. This means that when engaged in activities of care, moral deliberation emerges in and is delivered by the bodies of caregivers and receivers. Thus, care is an embodied notion, said Hamilton. On the other hand, the moral virtues of sensitivity, thoughtfulness, gentleness, and respect are expressed aesthetically in caring attitudes and action, but also the opposite, the affective and emotional aspects of our interaction can help to trace forms of cruelty, oppression, inequality, and dependency that exist in many careless contexts. In any case, since aesthetics of care claims that the aesthetic dimension of care is integral to care, insofar as it embodies it, this contributes to nurture our practices of care, and so maybe we can try to use it to train people in good care. Care aesthetics is the aesthetics of our relationships with objects and environments, but especially with humans, and seeks new forms of sociability to raise empathy, interdependence, equality, and reciprocity. Care practices take place mostly as part of our ordinary lives. Therefore, everyday life aesthetics that focuses on the aesthetic appreciation of our ordinary activities and also tries to shape them as they see that they are influential to people's welfare and happiness, has taken natural interest in the aesthetics of care. But in the artistic terrain that occupies me here, I'll finally go back to theorists of performative practices, particularly in applied theater and socially engaged performance, who have also proposed an aesthetics of care to be applied to particular social policies. As seen in the example of intimate bridges, these artistic practices are between art and social work and offer participatory and collaborative projects that sets up spaces and mechanisms for interaction and cooperation of participants, as I defend in the vein of the art of political capabilities. Many examples of collaborative projects that embodied care, acts and relationships are given in the book edited by Amanda Fisher Stewart and James Thompson, Performing Care. The described and analyzed projects are developed in theater, but mostly outside the artistic spaces like hospitals, schools, care homes, prisons, and so on. The guiding idea of this collection of papers written by people who are involved in performative arts is to show the importance of arts practice in building and sustaining more equitable, just, and caring societies, particularly in our contemporary moment where carelessness and neglect appear to be the dominant mode of political social action. Therefore, the assumption is not only that care is performative, but also that certain artistic practice can be acts of care, helping to express, but particularly to promote, relationships of care in right ways. One of the editors, James Thompson, argues for a connection between the care that happens through the process of working with people, materials, and places during playful situations, rehearsal, or staging, and caring in other contexts, even more formal and institutional settings. And for him, the affective solidarity and felt sense of justice that emerges in these situations must be foundational both to the ethics and aesthetics of theater and arts practice that seeks to engage with communities. Because these moments of collaborative creation, conjoined effort and intimate exchange exhibit aesthetic value. Caring has a certain craft and involves the creation of sensory embodied experiences. An affective and sensory dynamic that he marks becomes located in the mutual interaction that is only possible because of the relationships that are created by the event. There is a long and abundant literature on the ethical and political effects of practice, art, particularly theater. Recently, Tracy Nichols has explored the ethics of performance improvisation that, according to her, promotes participatory and civic virtues of engagement, dialogue, respect, and community building, as well as the ability to negotiate differences and willingness to accept the challenges of risk and contingency. The ethos of improvisation, that she theorizes, takes as its central values commitments to inclusivity and responsiveness and moves us beyond the abstractions into concrete personal obligation. So all this fits within the frame of care ethics and its emphasis in the openness and attention to the other with its own particularities, along with the awareness of our mutual interdependence and ideally the reciprocity. But the aesthetics of care adds the significant role of the aesthetic value that is relational, or what Thompson insists is located in between people. Care can be too, then a source of a powerful aesthetic experience, an aesthetic engagement that may involve the intervention of all body senses, say touch, smell, and taste, along with sight and hearing. It is also a relational aesthetics that matches care ethics as a relational ethics in the sense marked by Nell Nodins. Although with significant predecessors in some practices of the avant-garde, certainly the term relational aesthetic was proposed by Nicolas Bourriaud. Bourriaud wanted to account for artistic projects such as Tiravanillas that worked as setups for people interactions by involving them in certain everyday life and social activities like cooking, eating, sleeping, playing ping pong, and so on. For Bourriaud, these artistic practices are relational art that consists of the relationship that is spontaneously generated by participants' interactions with each other and the environment. He characterizes the relationality created by these social participatory artistic projects as transitivity, encounter, and dialogue, and promotes democratic participation. However, among other critics, Bishop criticized Bourriaud's examples because of the seemingly democratic participation is compromised by the predisposition of a like-minded audience of art lovers. For Bishop, we cannot forget the why of art. Who is the audience? How is the culture made, and for whom? And I agree. In these artistic games that Bourriaud praises, relationality is too cool, harmonious, too easy. According to Bishop, that compromises the pretended democratic character. Bourriaud's example lacks social conflict and antagonism that prevails in society, blocking the possibility of such microtopias. Years later, in the conclusion of her book Artificial Health, Bishop insists, participatory art is not a privileged political medium, but is an uncertain and precarious as democracy itself. Neither are legitimated in advance, but need continually to be performed and tested in every specific context. Furthermore, when analyzing the social tone in art, Bishop asserts that if ethical criteria have become the norm for judging this art, then we should also need to question what ethics is being advocated. And again, I agree. Now she reiterates the aesthetic political value of surprising, even unsettling and disturbing the audience, in contrast to a certain humanism where empathetic identification is highly valued. As only, she said, this can facilitate a reciprocal exchange that allows us to think outside our own lived experience and establish a more compassionate relationship with others. Well, yeah, almost there. Thank you, Alessandro. So the ethics and aesthetics of care do not exclude other ethical commitments or the effectiveness of other artistic and aesthetic avenues for political activism. But as I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, they reclaim the value of humanism and insist on the need to cultivate empathy as a political response to the moment we are in. And while Thompson also critiques Bourriaud's relational aesthetics for not suggesting why relations with others might be endorsed or what type of relations we might aspire to develop, he accepts his perspective that making art could be a proposal to live in a shared world. Ethics and aesthetics of care can thus provide that reorientation, in my view, by developing, among other things, an art of the political capabilities. And Thompson warns, this is not to say we will have to witness insipid and challenging performances. Neither we can expect that there will be no conflicts and facile agreements will be always encouraged, but rather the opposite. But having care ethics as a moral compass means that in collaborative artistic projects, attitudes matter and the commitment for respectful cooperation comes first. And of course, as Bishop also suggested, each project can and should be tested by paying attention to its uniqueness, focusing on the ideas and emotion it generates in participants and spectators. As we have seen, Tronto's model for effective care is useful precisely for measuring whether a project is more or less successful. Moreover, the possible skepticism regarding the impact of these ethical aesthetic practices can be overcome if we consider that care is an activity that relies on skills which are learned and trained. Theories in applied theaters and socially engaged performance defend that performance matters, as it is a way of training people to think with creativity. Maurice Hamilton understands care as improvisational moral performance, where the right thing to do emerges within relational experience. To my view, this emergent normativity in care action derives from the specific kind of deliberation that could be signaled as constitutive or required by the telos in some particular circumstances, and something that is alien both to instrumental and rule models without rendering the subject's choice arbitrary. On the other hand, care is, also using Corby's terms, a dialectical activity that involves value conflict. James aims to solve problems relationally, together. The model of improvisation in performance is thus offered as an adequate for training care attitudes. Hamilton notes that the learned habit of improvisation is still a habit. Improvisation is not pure spontaneity, it is rehearsed, trained, and uses the actor's skill in service of a goal as entertainment, dramatic preparation, or care. So from this perspective, a caring improvisation is a moment when we draw upon a set of rehearsed cognitive and bodily skills of inquiry and action to responsibly perform care on behalf of the needs of others. Improvisation uses the actor's skill in service of a goal of caring, applies the caregiver's proficiency in responding to need. So to sum up these acting techniques that combine spontaneity, physical and mental habits would be useful to train good care as a sort of moral education that generates disposition in individuals to act and respond in care relationships with attentiveness and empathy to others' needs. The body aesthetics is key in training our attention and perception, understanding nonetheless that while care might be exhibited fleetingly, it's more likely that care aesthetics will be realized in a more enduring, crafting encounters between people and takes time. And of course, the difficulty in nurturing an ethics of care through an aesthetic process should be acknowledged. But like Anna Serlenga, another participant in Intermediate Bridges, I believe that theater has a powerful transformative capacity, not only because it creates a safe space in which the creation becomes possible, but mostly for being conveyed through the body, embodied in the most intimate sense possible. So these artistic practices seek to train people in sustained, trustful, empathetic, caring relationships toward others and the world by performing or embodying this attitude. And let me finish by recalling, I took this because I don't know if you can read it, what is in the empathy kills. By recalling Joan Fonde's words, empathy is not weak. Actually, it may well be, as Nichols declares, that the only hope we have of building societies that are peaceful and prosperous for all is to train members of these societies to respond creatively, rather than fearfully, to see all as engaged in variations of the same projects. I have tried to show that the promotion, through the promotion of these ethical aesthetic caring activities, this is the purpose to which a good deal of political art nowadays is destined. And thank you very much.
Muchas gracias Matilde, molte grazie per questa relazione così ricca e profonda e articolata. Apro subito il dibattito, vedo che c'è una domanda, anzi 2, 3, perfetto. Allora, Maria Grazia, Filippo, Ettore e poi vuoi venire qui? No, Maria Grazia, scusa, Roberta, scusati. No, scusa che ti ho confuso.
So, many thanks for your talk. I really appreciated your proposal of an aesthetics of care, and particularly your pervasive, I would say, effort to translate the traditional lexicon of autonomistic aesthetics into something completely new. However, I have a doubt related to one of the slides you presented, and particularly regarding the opposition that you still try to emphasize between telos on the one side and goals on the other side. I wonder if this kind of dichotomy is running the risk to reintroduce the old-fashioned categories and attitude that is typical of autonomistic aesthetics. So maybe some more words about this dichotomy, and if it is just a dichotomy or let's say a kind of merely conceptual radicalization having hermeneutical value or not. Thank you.
Allora, abbiamo 5 domande ancora dopo questa, per dire che rispondi intanto, contestereste proprio.
Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I use the terminology used by this moral philosopher, Joseph Kobi, which I find very interesting because he's a moral philosopher. He's not speaking about aesthetics, but by saying that differentiate care from an instrumental activity where, the process that matters and make, focusing on saying that the action is constitutive of reaching the purpose. He is, without mentioning, speaking of aesthetics of care, because he says the carer involved, or the people, because it's not only the carer, it's the relationship between the carer and the people that receive the care, In this relation is where, there's no formulas for care, so you need to know what to do, taking into consideration the situation and the specifics. He compares it with moral dilemmas, somehow, when, norms are, there, but you need to construct what you say, like a normativity that emerges there, then, so there's a similarity in the reasoning, the moral deliberation. But the point is, by talking about this telos, the constitutive action, I'm mentioning how the deliberation is given by perception, attention, and that he is, without saying, pointing to the aesthetics of care, because there's no other way to know. That's the thing. You need to train your perception, the recognition, the attentiveness, and this is something, it's a skill that is embodied. So by signaling the idea of telos, it means like it's there. When you are engaged, they say you can have an idea of what you want to do, but until you're involved, you really cannot say, how it's going to go. And that's why I like, even if you're right in the sense that, I like that the idea of, this is there, it's in the activities, there's no guarantee, you say, that you're doing the right thing, but you have to be very, attend to the situation, to the particulars. And so he's a moral philosophy speaking about moral deliberation, but to my point of view, using or implying that there is an aesthetics involved there as integral to the action. Thank you.
So we have to take care of the time. Sorry for the pun. Ettore Rocca. No, va bene. Domande edificanti, risposte così.
The point of the part of my question is the quotation of Hamilton. And my point is whether a philosophy of care presupposes a theory of needs, because otherwise you don't know what you are taking care of. So, and there I think, for example, radical needs. So, in a theory, the necessity of a theory of needs as presupposition of philosophy of care.
Thank you. Well, in principle, care ethics is not committed to principles, you will say, by definition. Because as we said, there's no formula. Care is something that has to adapt not only to particular circumstances, but the cultural and the gesture that we seem appropriate in another context is not. So it's very difficult to know, to have like, if that's what you mean, the idea of needs. Of course, when I was talking about capabilities, I don't know if you're familiar to the work of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen on the topic. They have like a list of capabilities, which is not exactly probably what you're talking about needs, but yeah, they came to contest a certain, especially utilitarian, but also other more deontological, moral approaches by saying that equality starts with the capability. Do people to secure their lives, and especially their idea of good, good life, and this is very important for them. So that's what will be like basic, this kind of respect to the autonomy, and obviously the safety and health and things like that too, But they're very into, thinking about equality and justice from, from the context and the people, what people think, as we cannot say to them what they need. They have to, it comes from their own views and their own context and that. So having a more rigid structure to impose, it will not be very, I think, in the spirit of this proposal. Well, that will be my answer.
Okay, we still have 6 questions, and I could also put myself on the list, but I avoid that. I suggest to collect some questions, if you agree, okay? Starting from Filippo.
Yes, thank you so much, Matilde. Very sympathetic to much of what you said, so thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could sort of place your proposal for me. So there's been a lot of talk about interaction between aesthetic values and ethical values, right? And most of the interaction has been sort of in one direction, right? So the sort of moralist views, right? So let's say that ethics, ethical values influence aesthetic values, right? For better or worse. Much less there's been talk of the other way of the interaction from aesthetic values influencing ethical values. Is this latter interaction sort of the place where you would position your view, or is it a mutual bivocal interaction between ethical and aesthetical values, or what is it? Right, thank you.
Well, thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. I have a quick question about about artistic value. I quote from your PowerPoint. you said the aesthetic and political are inseparable, and art has the power to alter and shift people's capabilities. The practice of care also an artistic dimension. And I was wondering, do you think that we agree that art has the power to enhance our empathy, but do you think that it is an intrinsic value of art, or are you describing a recent trend in art? So, I mean, yeah, okay, you understood the question.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot for your extremely stimulating talk. I have two questions. I will try to be very quick and precise, I hope. So the first question is if you have mentioned some examples that exemplify this framework of the aesthetics of care. And I wanted to ask if your in your work, you have also considered examples from the so-called popular arts. Because I mean, a part of my work is in the aesthetics of popular arts, so those examples come very spontaneously to my mind while listening to you. And could we apply the framework of the aesthetics of care to the understanding of popular arts? In one passage you mentioned the intellectually despised realm of mass culture. So that captured my attention for those reasons. And I think that many of the concepts you mentioned, the participatory art, the performing care, emancipatory art, they may apply very well to some forms of popular music or other. So yes, this is the first question. The second one, when you mentioned the Jane Fonda statement and so on about empathy, you spoke of understanding other human beings and solidarity with one another. And I wanted to ask if in the examples you have analyzed about the aesthetics of care and so on, you have only focused on care for other human beings, let's say, or also works of art or performance events that focus on care for non-human animals or care for the environment, care for the landscape. These are all topics that are widely debated here.
Many thanks, Matilde, for your talk. Just one question. Yes, you mentioned two fields, so to say, aesthetics of care as part of everyday life and eventually everyday life aesthetics, and applied theater and politically engaged performance. I was particularly interested in the definition caring as a certain craft. So something you can learn, something you can also yes, you can train and so on, involving a creation of a sensory embodied experience. I'm a bit worried, however, about the faith in the continuous consideration of the transformative power of theatre. This is an emphasis I don't understand. I don't understand because we live as a transformative, we live in a transformative dimension always, and this craft, caring as a certain craft, I imagine is supposed to be a craft you can apply and you can learn in the event, in every event. So improvisation could be a value in this sense. Thank you.
Barbara Formis.
This list of people coming. There's Matilde. I'm curious about what you think about Yuriko Saito book, Aesthetics of Care, that you haven't mentioned. And because I think that she has a particular hypothesis that I think is very interesting in care, which is the practice of everyday life and also the materialization of care, which can have, this would be my hypothesis, transformation on the subject taking care of things, because it does require to be conducted by something else or somebody else. And this leads me to this another maybe aspect, which is the more feminist aspect of care, which is not feminine at all, and how you think about this.
Last but not least, Chiara.
So, thank you so much. I will try to be very quick. The first question is, why do you, if I understand correctly, you propose care as a kind of adaptive habit. Why do you need art in this performance? Because care is an ordinary practice in the way you propose it, and art still, it still is somehow extraordinary. This was the first issue. The second one is the needs of the others. The needs of the others can be needs that we dislike, and the others can be people that we dislike. But if care is a really powerful notion and practice, you actually have to take care of people that you deeply dislike. So what place has the hate even in your proposal? Thank you.
Great. Okay. Matilde.
Wow. Thank you very much to everybody for all these great questions, and I'll try to answer them all as best as I can. Let's start with Filippo. I see care aesthetics as a contribution to care ethics. I know that there are other accounts, and I start I'm going to answer also Barbara, because I think Euricositis is a bit more ambitious than that. I haven't mentioned that, that's true, and I'm sorry, I was already, because when I mentioned that care has been obviously of interest of everyday aesthetics, she is the most prominent figure in this field, but I wanted to deal with artistic practices. And that said, I think to me it's important that the basic idea of care aesthetics is that actions of care, practices of care has an aesthetic dimension, but they're driven by, in my opinion, an ethical motivation. To me, maybe I disagree in certain points with other people working on this, but for me it's important that in order to prevent some aestheticization of the issue. Again, this is obviously a matter of discussion, but for me it's a contribution to care ethics. And as I said, and that's why I brought up these moral philosophers, they're speaking about care ethics without realizing that they need aesthetics. And the aesthetics is part of, is integral to what they're asking, to what they're claiming, And so for me, that's important. Of course, aesthetic nurtures, because it's part of the thing, as I explained to the very first question, no? But the motivation is ethical. To care. There's a problem here, obviously, that is the ambiguity of the concept of care, no? But to be involved in an action of care, that's why I use Tronto, it means certain things. You can talk more generally about caring about things, but I want to emphasize what is taking care of something, and that's a distinction that also Nalnodians made, and I would like to emphasize that. But that's obviously not everybody thinks that way, but that's the way I think. Popular art, I think, and I was saying that this transformation of the emotions, that obviously gave back to the political discourse and activism, emotions that were considered. I'm familiar also with Nicola Wolterstorff's approach. You must be too, the why philosophy are not interested in kissing and touching and that. Well, now we are, no? So I will not make a distinction. Anyway, the projects I'm interested in, I think they're quite popular in the sense that they are, they're not developed in artistic. This is a big difference with Nicolas Bourdieu, for example, relational aesthetic. No, they go to the streets, they go to the schools, they go to hospitals, and so there's no, try not to be any elitist at all. So yeah, no problem. I would like to emphasize that better in the future. And yeah, I can obviously, I've been focusing a lot in the interpersonal relationship, but environments and the objects, and the contribution of aesthetics of care to our field, aesthetic, I think it's got a lot of potential, even if I wanted to concentrate in this like dyadic relation, which is probably the primary when you talk about care. Elena, the transformation, well, yeah, one issue, I mean, but I think maybe they're very modest proposals, but I think they have an impact. Some of these projects that I've been mentioning, we had in Torino, recently a session about this. I analyzed a bit more deeply, each of them and the results and how people reacted and I think they made a difference. So of course we kind of think in utopias in the way, but I think they're really trying to do something. And the point is, and I respond also to, I try to answer Barbara, of course, and Chiara, of course the care is an ordinary practice. But the care aesthetics is developing in these two big trends: everyday life aesthetics and the performative arts. Somehow, rather independently, but I think they share, basic claims. And as I said, Yuriko Saito has a great book on that, and is, other people following her, and I like it too. I've been working on that too, but I wanted to concentrate here in what art can do for it. And I think people in the theater have a lot to say, precisely because what I was telling Elena, to her question, answering to her question, about using these techniques that come from theater to, making people come together, looking them in the eye, create empathy. I think there's no other way. I mean, you have to trust people somehow, even if we live in times where, well, what else can you do? You have to make people realize that we are all connected and that it's important. And you can hate people, but we have to live all together. When I quoted Jane Fonda, she was mentioning the very same thing. And even Misha Sherry, when I was talking about anger, you can't be, you cannot just be all the time hating and cultivate. You have to practice empathy. And I think what these techniques propose is to practice empathy without obviously being naive in the sense that conflict will arise, as I mentioned, but the working and together and trying to solve things together, that has to come first. And if we don't realize that, we're really lost. That will be that's why I think care has become such a political issue nowadays, because empathy is right at the focus of the public debate, I think politically, especially, with all the troubles we are facing nowadays. So, well, it's a contribution. I'm not trying to say that this is it's going to solve the problems, but people are trying, and activists are trying. That's why I mentioned these movements, social movements too, that they think that create these networks of solidarity, it's a way to fight. It's a way to fight, and that's what I wanted to present here. That there are people in the arts that, with their own background in theater, they're trying to do something about this.
Thank you very much, Matilde. Grazie mille. Grazie a tutti. Grazie davvero.
Scusate, rapidissimamente, essendo l'ultima sessione plenaria del nostro convegno, volevo ringraziare tutti per la partecipazione, non solo i keynote, non solo tutti coloro che hanno presentato una relazione, ma tutti voi che avete partecipato. Naturalmente il convegno non finisce, prosegue nell'altra sede, come vi dirà poi Giacomo. Ovviamente il ringraziamento principale va a Giacomo che ha organizzato il convegno. Vi raccomando di seguire le attività della società durante l'anno, ci saranno parecchie iniziative locali e ci diamo appuntamento tutti a Lugano l'anno prossimo. Grazie.
Grazie Presidente, consentitemi di chiudere così come ho iniziato. Sento di dover ringraziare una serie di persone il cui apporto a vario titolo è stato essenziale per la riuscita del convegno. Qui all'interno dell'Università il Rettore ovviamente Stefano Bronzini, il mio Direttore Paolo Ponzio, anche la Direttrice, probabilmente non l'ho citata la scorsa volta, l'altro ieri, la Direttrice del Dipartimento di Scienze della Formazione Loredana Perla, che ci ha consentito di utilizzare le aule dell'ex Palazzo Poste, Antonella Lampignano, Gianni Rafazzini, Alessia Fanelli, Mario Sivecchia, Carlo Pontrelli, Emanuele Ponzio, Ilario Mastropasqua, Maria Martinelli e Anna Lucia Leccese del nostro Dipartimento, le dottorande e i dottorandi che avete anche avuto modo di conoscere in questi giorni, Savino Carbone, Antonella Colangiuri, Vanessa Riela, Roberto Rizzi, Giuseppe Vacca, Marianna Misuriello, che è anche il soprano che avete potuto ascoltare l'altro giorno, Antonio Lombardi, e poi al di fuori dell'Università il Sindaco di Bari, Vito Leccese, l'assessore alle culture. Mi piace molto il fatto che loro abbiano fatto questa precisazione, Paola Romano, la Presidente del Consiglio regionale della Puglia Loredana Capone, Luciana Cazzolla, Elisa Pietropaolo, sempre dell'assessorato alle culture, Maudes, la società che ci ha sponsorizzato, l'Accademia di Belle Arti di Bari, saluto anche Maria Angelastri che ha seguito i lavori del nostro convegno e anche partecipato ai saluti, ha preso parte ai saluti iniziali, le guide turistiche di Velo Service di Bari e di Visit Mola di ieri, forse li ho detti tutti, grazie ovviamente a tutti voi. Ultime indicazioni, ma sono davvero le ultime, giuro che non vi scriverò più messaggi per i prossimi X mesi. Continuiamo i lavori, come diceva il Presidente Paolo D'Angelo, nell'ex Palazzo Poste, Eleonora Caramelli e Maria Grazia Portera saranno al CERO questa mattina, c'è lo spostamento dell'aula per come vi ho indicato, l'aula B non è utilizzabile per la storia del proiettore, quindi saremo nell'aula A. L'aperitivo all'1, vi prego di essere precisi perché così quelle poche cose che mangerete, davvero sono poche, non è una battuta, non immaginatevi una cosa faraonica, così le mangiamo anche calde e chi deve partire insomma può consumare l'aperitivo senza fretta. Se ci sono altre cose fatemelo sapere, grazie ancora, buon viaggio e a presto. E grazie a Matilde Carrasco naturalmente, a Luca Lopinto e a Pietro Folena. Grazie anche a te Alessandro.